Buongiorno tutti. Benvenuti tutti alle Olimpiadi delle Vendite a Freddo. Io mi chiamo Rebecca. How is everyone doing? Hopefully you don't have weather like that. By the way, we have to put a poinsettia, or what is that called? That's not a poinsettia. Clearly, I'm not a flowers gal. We have to put that in the way because I think we got too close to the Olympic flu, too close to the Olympic sun, because YouTube started paying attention to us. Welcome, 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 welcome. How's everyone doing? Okay, two things I want to know. If everyone would jump in the chat if you're here, and I want to know, good morning. Good morning. You call it the FTS fam. Buongiorno. Oh my gosh. Bonjour. Bonjour. Jean-François. Comment ça va? Now you're getting my head in French. Thankfully I returned to my car and they asked me, they said, are you Rebecca? And I said, c'est moi. Naturally, I said, c'est moi back. So I thought you would like that piece of fact. So the two things that I want to know is, number one, is everyone up to speed / did you see the wolf that came into the games yesterday? Did everyone see that article or see any of the news on there was a wolf dog that came in the basically at the end of the cross country skiing. There was two Olympians that were about to finish and take the gold and silver medal. And this wolf dog came in on the scene and started running along with them, which was really cute. And the photo finish people, like the official Omega speed time people, got the wolf dog like on the actual radar camera. And you would think like, okay, we might be scared of this wolf dog because it looks like a wolf. And he was sweet as can be. Started like licking the faces of all the like Olympic employees. So it was really, really cute. So I want to know if everyone saw that. And did everyone, in second news, watch short skate? Yeah, cross country skiing. Short skate. Did everyone watch short skate yesterday? Or short track? I'm sorry. Short track. So I went to short track for the first time yesterday. This is the first speed skating rounds that I have seen. And y'all, it is wild. Absolutely wild. You would think people are like cheering for the gladiators. I kid you not. That it's been like, and for sure, number one for me so far is skeleton. I thought skeleton was amazing. But when I went to short track, I'm like, okay, this is a new favorite one. They iced down the ice 3 times with one of those water clean trucks right beforehand. They iced down the ice right beforehand, so it's ultra slick. And they take buckets of water between skates, so it's as slick as possible. So it's not like rare that someone slips. It's like very, very common that someone slips. So I saw probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 different falls, and there's only basically, we did men's 500 meter quarterfinals, which is 4 rounds, semifinals, which is 2 rounds, 2 rounds of the finals for the women's 3,000 meter relay, and then 2 rounds of 500 meter finals. And I probably saw, I kid you not, 4 or 5 falls. So it's very dramatic. So if you don't watch short track, for sure it became my favorite. If you don't watch short track, I would definitely give it a watch. There's short track tonight and tomorrow night. So I'm going tomorrow night. Today is the first day that I'm not going to an Olympics event. I'm flirting with the idea, potentially. It's going to kill me, like absolutely kill me in terms of my body, but I'm potentially thinking about, there's bobsled on the last day over in Cortina, which is basically like a 5-hour drive. So I'm thinking about bobsled tickets just freed up. So I'm thinking of going to see Feel the Rhythm, Feel the Rhyme, get on up. It's bobsled time. Go see the third and fourth main heats for the bobsled finals. And I'm also thinking about going to the closing ceremony. So I need a little encouragement to do both. If you don't care, I understand. If you want me to do either, then you're going to have to tell me in the comments, because I've been running around from town to town to town. So it's been nice to stay in the exact same spot, the exact same hotel, if you will, for the last couple of days. So anywho, okay, I'm going to jump into the topic. The topic for today is coaching. So this is what to coach AEs on, how to really coach AEs for conversion, from a conversion perspective. Most AEs, most AE programs, let's start there. There is some type of coaching. I see very few AE programs that they're bereft of the idea of coaching, but the efficacy can go up and down. And because the efficacy can go up and down, oftentimes people kind of just cancel them, right? So I wanted to go into a thoughtful, really meaningful way to coach AEs. Coaching can be really effective, but it depends on what you're coaching on, and are you doing it in a systematic way, in a centralized way, in a way that makes sense, in a way that you're tracking, in a way that actually works. You have advice on how to do something better that actually works better than what they're currently doing today. So basically, does it work? Is it systematic? And can you find it in a centralized place? Are going to be all the dragons that people are going to be fighting. So why don't we go ahead and jump into lap one. So I have a template. Now, keep in mind, I put together, why are those guys doing backflips in the snow? That's got to be Americans. Sorry, guys. That has to be Americans. 100% chance. So point being, I have a 5-stage document, which is meaning a 5-stage program. I'm not saying that you should necessarily start with all of these. Meaning, if you're just starting out a coaching program, I would focus probably on stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, like kind of, ratchet up as you go. So I wouldn't start with all of this right off the bat, but I usually start with something more fundamental, more sophomoric, before I promote to the second stage and so on and so forth. So the first stage of what I look for in stage number 1, so an easy place to catch AEs in terms of efficacy is the number of the summary points that are about them. So if you go over on the left-hand side, if you have some kind of recording software, you have some kind of AI, hookup, I would look through and look up at the summary of the call and look at what percentage of the points of the summary of the call are about your company versus what percentage of the points are actually about the prospect. So in my opinion, around 90% of that conversation should be around the prospect, meaning what they're doing, what they're thinking, all the different current state items, all the different details that you can't get access to online. So the first thing that I would look for is, are you getting the prospect to talk, or is the AE getting the prospect to talk? Until that number is at minimum 50% of the time. I mean, it needs to really be around 75%, in my opinion, to be passable. But until that's at minimum of 50% of the time and they're not going on long rants, then I would focus there. So we're going to get into this, but essentially what I would do is I would prescribe something and then look for that thing to get better. And if it doesn't get better the next call, then don't move on. Like basically for the summary point, for example, if you go to the next point, go to the next call or the next session, and the AE is still talking 75% of the time, I wouldn't move on to teach them something else, because essentially everything else that would come after that is going to be, now that you're not talking, what are you getting them to talk about and what are you discovering? So I would start with that at stage 1 and not promote until they successfully get there. Stage 2 of a coaching program is kind of a double down on the summary points, but it's really from a tactical perspective, thinking about how active listening was the account executive, and also how much did they effectively get the prospect to come out of their shell. So the 3 things that I look at is, number 1, when the prospect spoke, what percentage of the time and volume of times when they stopped did the rep follow up with a question. So a quick way, an easy way to do this, it doesn't take me long in the beginning to really listen to calls, meaning, usually the most common mistakes are pretty overt. But I would just look at the call, look at what percentage of the time that the rep is talking. And then when the prospect stopped, like if you have like a recording software like Kaya with Outreach, then I would look at when the prospect stopped, just double click on that portion and hear what the prospect was ending with, and then hear what the rep did next. So no matter what the person said, whether they asked a question or if they said something, the rep should be asking a question next. So I would go to those pieces of the pie and basically click on that any part of the conversation and say, what percentage of the time did the rep actually ask a question versus start talking about something? And it doesn't even really necessarily, in my opinion, what they start talking about, just that they start talking. Meaning, did they start to say something, case study, explain a feature, et cetera, or did they actually ask something? So that's the second thing that I would think of within stage two. The other second thing in stage two is when they mentioned a problem or a struggle, did the seller double down? So when they said, so the general rule of thumb I say is if a prospect, says we've had a struggle with, we've had a challenge with, we've had a problem with, then the rep immediately should double down. So what percentage of the time in terms of questions that were asked or times that it was mentioned, did the rep actually successfully say? And a great question to say is, what do you mean by that? So if they say we've been having a lot of problem with the end of our races recently, I'm like, what do you mean by that? Or we had a huge problem with the end of our race yesterday. What do you mean by that? They might be saying, man, we tuckered out in terms of cross-country skiing and we lost the race. They might be saying that a random wolf ended up on the course and they couldn't get around them. So, and the spread can be that vast. And so I'm always asking a question there. So what percentage of the time did they ask a question versus did they double down and ask a question versus did they go straight through it? And then the third piece of stage two is when the prospect mentioned a subjective term, how often did the rep ask them to define it? Now, you don't have to define every single one of them. Some of them are going to be more important than others. I'm always viewing the call as in the top of the muffin episode in Seinfeld, meaning, based on the information that is presented and the information that the questions that I ask, what is the best question or information to acquire based on what they've told me, based on what I don't already have answered, and based on what would help me find an unknown and confirm their diagnosis as it exists. So, in terms of that, when I'm thinking about the call, when the prospect mentioned a subjective term, you can't follow up every piece of data with the question. So I have a running list on the right-hand side of all the questions that I would ask in real time. And then when the prospect takes a breath, and there's an obvious pause in the conversation, I look to the list and I keep in mind, I'm like, which items do I really, really need versus second to best, third to best, et cetera. So when the prospect uses subjective term, high, low, good, bad, et cetera, what percentage of the time did the rep ask them to define it? What do you mean by low? What do you mean by you've been slipping around the curves a lot in short skating? What percentage of the time are you slipping when you go around the track? So that is stage two, is subjective terms. What percentage of time did they ask a question when they mentioned a struggle? And then what percentage, when the prospect spoke, what percentage of time did they follow up with the question? Okay, stage three, how many questions did the rep ask in total? Out of all of the questions, how many of them were qualifying or bank questions? Out of all the questions, how many of them were a leading question? Out of all the questions, how many of them were subjective and included a subjective term? How many of all the questions were self-diagnosis questions? And how many times did the rep use the word if? So now we're looking at the quality of the questions. So by way of knocking out, how often did they do something negative that they should really stay away from? So those are all the main types. Now, again, I listed 11 the other day: digital questions, blaming questions, confirmation questions. Can we both agree that blank? You can do this exercise really in depth, but I'm going to, always warn of it's in stages, right? So once they master that kind of turn, now they can master it in a more expert level of term. But until they get the prospect talking, there's nothing to talk about. It's not about the questions because they didn't ask any. So that stage three is really the quality of the questions and the quantity of the questions that they're asking. Number four was the business problem. So stage four, we're going to pivot to instead of what were they saying, what did they acquire? So stage four, simply put, I'm asking, was the business problem and was the business problem essentially acquired? Was the lagging indicator achievement acquired? Was the lagging indicator goal acquired? And was the buyer's self-diagnosis, how many components of the buyer's self-diagnosis were acquired? And what percentage of the time was the why behind that belief acquired? So this is something to fill out in the CRM. The biggest death to CRM fills or coaching in general is subjective open notes field, to where they just kind of give a narrative what they thought in the call. I would put a closed objective term of like, who was the buyer? They put in the KPI from a drop menu, and then it's like lagging indicator achievement, lagging indicator goal. So you can digitally understand, did they get the business problem or not? Most people aren't not doing things because they don't think they're valuable. They're doing them because they don't believe that they are, or they're doing them because they do believe that they're not. So, I would keep that in mind when you're thinking about assessing these calls. Is the reason that most people think that they have the business problem is just, generally speaking, we just think that we've done the job, So, but when I ask the questions, lagging indicator, goal, and achievement, then it turns into a completely different conversation. And then the last one is stage 5. Did the rep find a misdiagnosis, and did they find a missed diagnosis? How many, how big, how many linked impacts, how early in the call, and how many per buyer? There's France. We came in first. Look at us. We came in first. But the last piece of value that I would get to once I've gotten to all of those was, did they actually add value by finding something that the person didn't know? So did they find a misdiagnosis or a misdiagnosis, even if they acquired the knowns of the business problem? How many and what were the impacts? So you know how much value they add and how much trust and credibility you have with the buyer. Oh, metal. Y'all thought I wasn't going to finish that round on time. I know it. And it was a buzzer beater, to be honest. There's a lot to coach on. The main thing to focus on is stages and objective information, and especially that it's centralized and they're aware on what the criteria is. It cannot be I think that you should do this. It's number one, too loosey-goosey, and number two, you're not even 100% sure on, whether that's the most effective, and it can't be measured on over time if it's not preset beforehand. So the scorecard needs to be set beforehand for the rep really to even engage in coaching, because they know what the point system is. So that is the first lap. Why don't we go into lap 2? Isn't this so sad that we can't put the entire screen in the window? Well, to be fair, I think that was just like canoeing. RAI, which is the Italian channel, you never know what you're going to get. Sometimes they're at the Olympic Stadium, sometimes they just aren't. So top tips of effective coaching. So the first one I would think about is that the scorecard is established beforehand, meaning it needs to be established what is good and what is bad, and the most subjective, the better. So kind of like the session that we did yesterday on the brand director, on what brand awareness is or brand presence is, like unaided mentions versus prompted mentions, et cetera, et cetera. There needs to be a numerical, objective way to measure the call so they know what they're objectively after. You can't just say, go for the why behind the why, for instance. It's like, okay, I understand that conceptually, hypothetically, but what am I tracking and why am I tracking that thing? So I would look at, so the first thing is it needs to be an objective, established scorecard beforehand. The second thing is that it needs to be in a central location. So basically reps need to be able to know that I'm just going to put this out there. One of the one of the hardest stories to hear was about a CRO that essentially there wasn't feedback on, this is speed skating, on good, bad, or ugly. There wasn't too much feedback on the CRO, except for that the goalpost always changed. Like they would say, do one thing, do another thing, X, Y, and Z, and then on the next call, it's like maybe they would say do the opposite. So it's really interesting with I've studied very in depth all the different personality disorders, the 10 types of personality disorders, including narcissistic personality disorder. And one of the things that they do, just clinically speaking, is because the North Star, so to speak, is that they are correct, that the math will change and the setup will change essentially of what they're saying and what they say that they believe. So essentially the math can change no matter what, just dependent on the fact that their North goalpost of they're the best and they're the smartest stays the same. So I would think about with your reps, it needs to be a very defined criteria and it needs to be a very static criteria. they need to be sure that it's not going to move tomorrow, of like the number of time, the percentage that you are talking on the call, for instance. That's a static criteria. So is that going to be a criteria over time? And is the percentage of time that you're measuring for, is that going to stay consistent over time, or is it going to change on the next call? Something that they need to know. This was the women's 3,000 meter relay, by the way, which is very, very interesting. They do kind of a little bump. So they basically go around the track, and then to their partner, like the next one who's speed skating, they do a little bump. The U.S. actually got disqualified yesterday, which was really sad. But point being, it was pretty interesting to watch. So the next one is that it's centralized. The next one, a tip on coaching, is that it is documented. So it needs to be documented on both sides, on the manager who's doing it and the manager and the rep that is doing it. My next biggest tip is that both sides need to prepare beforehand. One of the biggest things that I see happen, and one of the biggest things that I've experienced, is you go into the coaching session and the manager hasn't even watched your call. So it's like, and they a lot of times are coaching off of hypotheticals and what ifs that don't apply to you, which is kind of like the point of, doing discovery to begin with, is finding out what's actually specific to the person, which is super ironic. So I would say both the rep and the manager need to have prepared beforehand. So what that means is they need to have invested. Otherwise, why not just pull the call? Coaching often gets a bad name because of how ineffective it is. And the reason it's ineffective is neither side prepares, and there's no static scorecard, meaning there's no actual point of view. So the rep needs to select the call, and the rep needs to put the reasoning behind why they selected the call, and review the call of like what really happened here, what was the context of what happened. And then the manager also needs to listen through that call and come up with relatively detailed notes and a punchline of, if all else fails, what are the things that they really need to work on, 1, 2, and punchline 3. If that hasn't been done, I'd say pull the call. Like, why not? Ineffective coaching is not better than no coaching. No coaching is better than ineffective coaching, in my opinion, especially if it's not data backed. It needs to be intentional. It needs to be thoughtful. It needs to be a building work and subsequential. And it needs to be that measured over time of, is this actually helping me? So that would be my next tip, is that both sides need to prepare. And if both sides haven't prepared, and sometimes people would be like, oh, well, that's a lot of work. And I'm like, well, that's the amount of work you should put into a coaching session. So whether you want to do that or not, like, if you don't want to coach, don't coach. But it needs to be an exercise that at least people are investing in from both sides. So otherwise, it needs to be, for lack of better terms, it can't be a show of like, I really helped this person, or I'm trying as much as I can. The hardest thing for managers, I believe, is, I think, because we haven't come out with what is a good and bad sales call, there hasn't been an objective definition of that. Everything else follows suit. So the reason I don't think that managers coach so much is because they don't know necessarily what to coach on. They don't know, what do I actually say in this slot to actually make the world better? So, I would get monomaniacal about finding out what is that. And then also, when you prescribe something, does it actually work? So if the rep actually takes the advice, statistically speaking, is the call getting better over time? Meaning, are your conversion rates improving? Are the talk rates improving? Is the person coming out with more data? Are they finding more misdiagnosis? So those are my tips. And then the last tip that I would say is to have have specific detailed notes. Like, I do 2 sections of notes. The first section, and this is when I do like call reviews for my clients. The first section is basically a general notes section that I'm like, and it's specific. It's like at minute 3:22, you cut the prospect off. Minute 6:43, here's a sign the prospect just yawned, or the prospect hasn't talked in 2 minutes because of this cutoff 2 minutes ago. So it's that specific. And then the second category of notes is essentially when the prospect said something at a certain time clip, what was the question that should have been asked? Now, again, you can't ask all the questions, but it's a detailed list on all the questions that I would have from an open perspective. You would think I was very intimidated in the beginning, like, can I actually add value on all these calls because it's so many different industries? But because the coaching tenets stay the same and prospects are actually where it's such a, in my opinion, nascent stages of selling that, of like, okay, well, we just need to stop cutting off the prospect or we need to let the prospect talk. That it's easier than you think, meaning even though I don't necessarily sell to a CIO or CISO, it was pretty easy to jump in there with some advice on when they were saying something like prospects are relatively overt is what I'm trying to say. Like, man, we've had a lot of problems with network latency. So the next question is, naturally speaking, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by problems with network latency? So that's an example of a place where to jump in. So those would be my tips. And my last tip is, out of all of those tips, I would boil it down to like a top 2 or 3 that, three maximum of things that they need to change. So you can spend all your time as much as you can going through all of the quote unquote mistakes or spots that you would improve the call. But then at the end, it needs to be, okay, but here's the punch list of the, 2 things, like 2 things that you need to change by next time. And those are the things to measure of next call. Did they actually do those 2 things? So it's more simple, simplistic list. So it needs to be a centralized list, an objective list, and a central place. It's the same essentially for anyone. It's the same video game of Mario Brothers with the same 5 stages. Now, where they're at in the stages is completely different. That's what coaching, in essence is. But, when you go into the call, it needs to be well prepared. Both of you need to have prepared. And there needs to be a, in my opinion, exhaustive list of things of notes and questions that they could have asked with a 1, 2, or 3 punchline of, if nothing else, these are the 2 things you need to focus on before the next call. I'm done, Min. So we can clear the pizza clock. Can I get those 29 seconds back? Do I get 29 gold medals because I was 29 seconds ahead? Please don't answer that, because that means that I get 29. In the other cases where I go too long, I don't even know what I get. I get timeouts. Okay, so let's go into the next lap in terms of coaching. So next lap, now we know what to coach on and some specific tips. How to structure a coaching session. Something that I would think about, well, let's start with the don't do's. The main thing that I see done that I wouldn't do is people get all their reps in a room and they'll review maybe 1 call or 2 call, and they'll just put it on. They won't look at it beforehand, and they'll say, what do we think? And all the reps will go, oh, I think this, and I think this, and I think this. And no one really walks away with anything. Even if you have a top performer, even if they are a top performer consistently, they don't necessarily know why they were a top performer. And they don't necessarily know what to tell the other people to do on the call to be different. Just because I'm good at, whatever it is, like figure skating or curling or whatever it is, doesn't mean I can necessarily identify why. So I would avoid any kind of group coaching situations, especially where you're going rep to rep. Now, I've seen this happen a lot, and people might say, well, what about collaboration? This needs to be a structured time between you and the rep if it's going to be meaningful. Group coaching does not usually typically move the needle at all. It makes people feel better, thus the damage. Meaning, if it feels like you went through a coaching session, but you didn't actually, it's actually more damaging because now you think you did what you have to do. So I would structure the session in terms of it's one-on-one only. And I would have them, the first thing that I would have them do, or the first thing that I'd have them prepare, is I would have them prepare or send over a call that they want to review beforehand. But that can't be the only thing that you review. The second biggest mistake that I see, or in my opinion, mistake that I see, is they only review a call that the rep sends over. So there are 2 things that you miss if that happens. Number 1, a lot of times they're only going to send over the calls that make them look really good. And I used to ask the question of like, hey, why, even in the sheet, why are you actually sending me this call? And the rep would say, I'd be like, well, why'd you pick this call? And sometimes the rep would like stop talking. They'd be like, I'm like, it's because you did really good, right? So they kind of want to show you that they did really good, but they don't really want advice. So that's the first thing that I would think about is like, well, that's the first thing I would include is asking them why they essentially chose the call at hand. I would hope that people choose the least effective call or one call where they messed up, but humans are humans, number one. And sometimes they don't even know which was the least effective call. So, but I would give them the opportunity to bring one call that you review. But the second biggest mistake is that coaches stop there, meaning I want a broad scape understanding of what this rep is doing for two reasons. Number one, because this one call that they prepared doesn't necessarily give me an accurate depiction of who they are. But the second thing is maybe some things they're doing are incorrect, but they're really egregious, but they only did it once. Whereas on all of the calls, they did something on scale of 1 to 10, a 4 in terms of how damaging it is, but they did it on every single call. So I, as a habit, would for sure, as a manager, put in my card, in my calendar, a 15-minute reminder to listen to my reps' calls every single day and look at their cold emails that they're sending every single day, and their activity metrics every single day. Now, I'm not going to necessarily do something about it, but it's going to help give me a good depiction over time about who the rep is. So coaching doesn't come down just to the session. Sometimes you'll catch something on a Monday, and you're like, oh, shoot, I need to tell them to do this. And that's what it's all about. Right. So I would make an ongoing habit of, and here's a frustrating thing that I'm going to throw coaches in the fire for a second, that here's the frustrating thing that I hear is they'll say, well, if I had known, or I'll say, like, it's been surprising to me how little managers often know about what the reps are doing. Like I'll say, how many emails are they sending per day? I'd say 85% of the time people don't know, which is a problem, right? So they'll say, now there are ways to make it easier and better of like, pin this comment for a second, man. There's ways to make it a little bit better, of like easier in terms of from a data perspective of what to surface and how to do that on the coach. But the fact is, if you are a leader, that is your whole job, I'd argue. And I'll ask coaches, I'll say, like for instance, if the conversation comes up about activity, they'll go, oh, I just didn't have the time. I'm like, what do you mean you just didn't have the time? I'm like, you were too busy in what? One-on-ones? I'm like, one-on-ones based on what? Based on what? So I would be very, very intentional about consistently looking at what my reps are doing from an activity perspective. And this is not micromanaging. This is micro learning, is what I would look at it as. Of like, when I go into that coaching session, I need to know for them specifically what is going wrong. There was a gig that I had last year where I was working with a team, and they were in a very ad hoc industry, a very, I would say, niche industry, one that I hadn't really coached in before. And the first session or two didn't go wonderfully well, I would say, from a training perspective. Like, I think there was a lot of, is this applicable to us? Which is rare for me nowadays because I train in their terms specifically. But one thing I did was I was working with the CEO directly. And so I was like, well, I need to turn this thing around. So I listened to 3 or 4 calls, and I showed up to the call and I said this, I said, I don't know what just happened. I think it just knocked off. So I said, okay, we're going to close out this series in terms of asking questions with a couple of pieces of theory on the back end. But in the meantime, I want to talk about asking more questions. The average number of questions, I listened to 100 calls, and the average number of questions that was asked were 3. And on average, 2.75 of them were bank questions, meaning very rarely were there any questions asked that weren't bank questions. The longest period of time that it took someone to just share their deck, meaning the longest amount of time that someone gave for someone to be the prospect to be talking, the longest was 4 minutes and 25 seconds. And then I just sat there. I was like, so let's talk about what questions that we can ask on the front end. And I asked the CEO afterwards and I gave them several different setups of like, okay, so this prospect said this, and this. I want you to go into a breakout room and ask what are and among the group, come up with a list of questions that you have that's outstanding from what that prospect said. And so afterwards, I talked to the CEO about it, and the CEO was tough on me, which he had all license to be. He had, he just wants to make his team more effective. It's a very big team, And so I talked to him, and he was really, really tough on me. And after that session, he was like, "That was brilliant." He was like, 4 minutes and 25 seconds. Are you serious? And we stayed on the line for 30 minutes. And I would say it's one of my premier marquee referral clients at this point, was because of how specific that I made it. So the point being, when you're thinking about coaching and structuring a session, it needs to be specific. So kind of from the top, from the session from front to end, I would have them bring you a call. I would and send over beforehand. You've prepared notes, they've prepared notes, and you spend the first, I would say, 30 minutes. It depends on how long the session is. If you can do 45, if you're only going to do 30 minutes, I'd spend the first 20 minutes on the call of going over your notes on the call, going over the questions they should have been asking, and then giving them a punchline of the 2 to 3 things that they should do better before next session. And then I'd spend the last 10 minutes or the last, 20 to 30% on giving them advice on things that they didn't bring to you. So I looked over all your calls, and on 80% of your calls, this is what happened. I looked at all your calls, and it looks like 95% of the time you're calling on Tuesday morning, when the best yield rate is going to be on Friday afternoon. So in that second portion, sometimes I even make that portion bigger, of like 50% or 75%, because they don't know what they don't know in terms of picking the call that needs to be reviewed. But I would spend the back half of basically that call essentially reviewing all of the things that you caught in aggregate that they didn't know. Okay, coaching is sometimes thought of as judging. So people in the mindset want to be seen as their best and not looking, to see where they can get better. It's so true, Jay Frank. It's so true. It comes down to mindset, and I think it also comes down to, does the advice actually make the rep better? If that's true, then oftentimes they'll ask for a person's appointed. Thumbs up. Where's the wolf? I almost put a joke of, you also need to work with coachable people. Yeah. If I was completely honest, I think most of the problem with coaching is not coachable people. I think most of the problem is with the coach. And I have a lot of empathy for that. It's hard to know what actually makes someone buy more effectively. It is what I set out to solve at the beginning. Is I'm like, how do I construct the perfect cold call? How do I construct the perfect, what should discovery really be about? Now, I had several different sales methodologies that I've been trained on of what they said it was about, but I still didn't believe that it had been answered. Meaning, from all of the methods that I knew to date, I'm like, there's still no objective answer, is what is discovery about from the buyer's point of view. So I had to go and seek that out and find my own answer for that. For that, essentially, that's how I got into training. Is I'm like, I worked for a couple, not one, but 2 conversation intelligence companies, meaning companies that record your call and tell you how to get better. And not even they know, of what is going to actually make someone buy. They just don't know. So I have a lot of empathy, but I think most of the blame, or most of the reason that most people fail is not because the person wasn't coachable. It's because the coach doesn't know what to coach on, and it's not objective, and also it doesn't make them better. I will say, I am, as a leader, I'm tough. I've been called the Snow Queen before, not by men. I've been called the Snow Queen before. I have a hard time with personal stuff, meaning I like, I'm getting awkward just talking about it. I'm like, I don't care about the personal life. I understand that affects business life. But I'm like, I'm counting down in my head the minutes, the seconds until I can transition in and talk about work stuff. That's just how I am as a coach. I will say, even though I struggled with that, and people knew. It wasn't that I cared about them. It wasn't that I didn't care about them. It was that I knew where I could show my care for them, and I knew what my job was. My job was to make them better. And I understood sometimes there are personal components of that, but I also kept that in check and in tow of like, my job is to make them better, not make them feel better. One of the biggest mistakes I see coaches make is they protect their team. I'm like, what, from hitting their number? Truly. I mean, a lot of SDR leaders will like be like, oh, the activity metric's too high. I'm like, that's a minimum. That's an absolute minimum. So even though I certainly had my gaps, so to speak, as a leader, I never had a rep churn on me, voluntarily churn on me. And if I had to guess why, it's because of the value of the coaching. Because I'm like, look, I can't tell you what to do in your life. I might have my gaps in terms of, I don't want to talk about you just broke up with someone. I really don't with anyone. But, if I had to guess where I excelled, it was send this exact email. We'd craft it together and I reach them through and it would work. Right. So it made up for all of the soft, cushy juju. So they're not there for they don't need a friend. They need someone who can make them better. And if your advice can make them better, I noticed that I almost got my reps too dependent on me, meaning they'd be running to me and they'd be like, what do I say in this exact instance? Because what I had said in the instance and crafted with them, the time before actually worked. So then they became too dependent on me. But it needs to be that situation. Otherwise, here's my challenge and push to leaders out there. You need to get out of the chair. If you don't, like from a distinctive perspective, know what will make someone better, or you tell someone to do something and it doesn't work, you need to get out of the chair until you know something that will, is my push and challenge to leaders out there. Okay, let's go into the next lap. So we're going to combine probably the next two laps of how to measure progress and drive for improvement over time in coaching logistics. But this is kind of all the gritty work. So what I measure over time is for those 5-stage criteria, just the objective measures. Like, so for instance, for stage 1, what percentage of the summary points were about the client versus, was about your company versus the prospect's company. I would measure that from a perspective over time. How much did it go up or down? Was it 90 one day in terms of them talking and then it went to 80? Was it 70 and then it went to 10? So I would measure that first piece over time. The second stage of like when the prospect spoke, what percentage of the time the rep followed up with a question. All of these are very, very objective things that you can measure over time. Of like what percentage of the time did they ask a question as opposed to start talking, on this call, and then on the next call, and then on the next call, and so on and so forth. So that's the second thing that I would be looking for. Stage 3, it's the exact same thing. How many questions did the rep ask on the call in total? Did they ask 10 in the first call and then they asked 15 on the second? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse over time, and by how much? Now, it's important to marker of in the beginning, you're only going to be focusing on, no matter where you are in the coaching process, you're going to be focusing on 2 to 3 exact things that are going to be, that are said and that they're doing that need to be improved. But I would just keep a good objective measure of these all over time of how many were they, and are they improving or are they not improving? Stage 4 was the business problem acquired. It's the same type of thing. What percentage of the calls were the business problem acquired beforehand, and is that improving over week to week to week? So this is more of an output that they're having to put within the CRM. And then the last one is misdiagnosis versus misdiagnosis for stage 5. Did they find any, how many, and how big was the linked impact to each one of these, and is that improving over time? So that's kind of how to measure things. Everything that the pain in the butt about making everything objective is there's no feeling left in it, meaning there's only numbers. But the positive thing about that is you can diagnose, number 1, where they went wrong, number 2, where they can improve, number 3, where they digressed, of like they decelerated their progress, and everything's measurable, right? So it becomes less of a feeling versus a fact of what's happening. One of the best things for me in terms of I very quickly, for a number of different reasons, it was back in 2019, I lost a bunch of weight. So very intentionally, I clipped off 60 pounds within like a couple of months. And how I did that was math. And this is pre-Ozempic too. Let me get ahead of it. Ozempic didn't even exist. This is back in like 2019, and how I did that was math. Once I understood the math of essentially, I had spent my life very thin, the majority of my life, and I put on weight for a very distinct reason, which is a funny reason. It's a whole nother topic for a whole nother time, but I'll never probably share. But point being, I put on weight for a very distinctive reason, and once that reason was gone, then I was like, okay, I'm going to take all this weight off me because it's not normal for me to be this heavy. So I essentially, studied right off the bat. I'm like, how do I do this? And once I understood, one of the things that I didn't understand was plateaus. Why do you plateau? Like you eat healthier, then you start to lose weight, and then all of a sudden you plateau. And I had to understand the math of plateaus before I could essentially even start the journey. And once I understood that whole thing of like, okay, well, you burn more calories the heavier you are. So when you weigh, let's say 300 pounds versus you weigh 200 pounds, you're going to burn more calories per mile at 300 pounds than you are at 200 pounds. And the maintenance calories get lower and higher depending on what weight you are. So what a plateau is essentially that you were losing weight when you were heavier because the amount of calories that you were burning with a certain amount of working out that you were doing and the amount of deficit that you had based on the maintenance calories that you needed to eat at the time, you cause a deficit. But once that deficit will start to dwindle and dwindle and dwindle because you're burning less calories as you're getting thinner, and your maintenance calories get lower. So the plateau is where that state of inflection point meets. Once I understood that and just the logistics of weight loss, it was easy because I understood the math of it and I understood the system behind it. And so it evaporated out all of the feeling out of losing weight. Like I feel like I'm not losing weight. I feel like I am kind of thing that I knew inputs would cause outputs, right? So I would think about coaching in terms of that, of like, how many questions did I ask? It should be less about, well, I feel that I asked a lot of questions or too many. It's just like I asked this many. And so over time, I know that if I ask more questions, then I'm going to be more effective as a coach. Sorry, as a rep. When to do it as a rep and as a coach. I would for sure at the beginning of every day, 15 minutes, listen to your own calls or listen to their calls. And what I would do is listen to them in aggregate, meaning you don't have to listen to the entire thing, but I would make a habit of 15 minutes a year spending doing the listening habit. And that to me, that you're listening in aggregate, meaning I would scan through all of the emails that my rep sent for the first 15 minutes of the day before. So there was nothing that happened that I didn't know about. Which wasn't a micromanaging thing. It was a data thing of like, my job is to get them better. If I can't get them better, then it's on me. Right. So I would listen to them in aggregate 15 minutes at the beginning of the day, so that I can understand what is happening. And I would also give it that primary time of, you just drank coffee, you kind of have a lot of motivation going on. So I would give it the prime spot because one thing that you can do to get better is listen to coaching, effective coaching, and learn about your buyer. So I would do both of those at the beginning of the day for 15 minutes apiece. That's it in terms of the logistics and everything with coaching. I'm going to give this story and then we're going to close out for the day. The story is this. The term coaching actually comes from back in late 1800s at Oxford. There was a group of tutors that, back in that period of time, how you traveled from location to location was by horse and buggy, essentially. And what that vehicle was called, where you held people, was a coach. And so tutors would tutor their students so well that it was a slang term that they would say, I tutored them so well that the reason that they got the A that they did, they would say, I coached them, meaning it's like I shoved them in the vehicle and I'm the horse and I took them there. I took the test almost for them. That's how effective my that tutoring session was. And now it's become a very watered down term, and people know that they need coaching and people know that they should coach. But because of the efficacy of it, I just haven't seen a lot of teams really lean into it. So the things that I would focus on is not should I do this or should I not do this? It's what are the things that my reps are doing and what are the things that I can train them on and coach them on that will make them better tomorrow in terms of numbers. You have to look at it like they are in terms of numbers. So the difference between training and coaching is training is I'm going to walk you scholastically through something. Coaching is for each person, where are they, specific person, where are they falling down and how are they falling down and when and why and what can I subscribe to them to do about it so that they can be better tomorrow than they are today in terms of effectiveness, in terms of their numbers. So that's it. That's everything in terms of coaching for today. Speaking of coaching, look who ended way early. Way early. I like how it's actually 4:00 on the dot, which is what in the beginning I said said we were going to be doing, even though I added way early. That is everything for coaching. Thanks so much for coming today. Tomorrow we're going to be going back to prospecting. So we're going to be jumping back to prospecting, and we're going to go into coaching for, I believe this is, maybe I'm reading this wrong. I believe we're doing coaching. Yeah, we're doing coaching for the SDR side of the house. So now that we've done AE, how do we coach SDRs? They're very different because the role is so different and what you need to do to be successful is different. So tune in tomorrow. I'm going to be posting a video for speed track or short track later. If you are watching from home, I would definitely watch short track, speed track. It's been amazing being able to watch that. It went from, I didn't know how it was going to be, but it certainly is number one on my list now. So thanks everyone so much for coming. I will see you tomorrow, and we're going to pick up on coaching for SDRs. And yeah, arrivederci for now. Ciao, y'all.